Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about like what's going on with single payer, but also where I'm directing my energies and where I kind of see things moving, and Kevin will help with that as well. I want to congratulate you on starting the single payer coalition that you're starting. You guys all give yourself a hand because this is tremendous. We were in Ashland last night, and the energy in Ashland was tremendous. We had a great turnout, people that came out to talk about the single payer campaign. And this is really, I think, an important step in moving towards single payer. We've seen Vermont do it. What they did, I think, sets a model for us. In 2009 and 2010, when many people in states were turning their attention to the federal legislation, the healthcare reform process in Congress, Vermont saw the future. They knew that whatever came out of Congress was not going to address our fundamental problems in healthcare, and it didn't. And so instead, they turned their time and energy and resources towards building an independent grassroots movement for single payer. They got out into their communities. They had truth hearings where people came forth and told their stories about what's happening to them and their family members, and practitioners telling their stories as well about what happens in this country, which is completely unacceptable, and I can talk a little bit about that. And so they built this grassroots movement, and then in 2010, when they were having their election for their governor, all of the Democratic candidates ran on a single-payer platform. Even Senator Leahy, who had never talked about single-payer before, he was suddenly like, oh yeah, single-payer, it's the best thing. So the candidate that won, Peter Shumlin, actually was the most aggressive single-payer candidate. He was the one that ran actual television ads talking about what single-payer is. And so then they were right in there in the legislature. They had a huge health policy group. They had identified principles. They used healthcare as a human right because that brings 5 principles with it, which act as a way to evaluate any type of legislation. Those principles are universality, everybody in, nobody out. Equity, which doesn't just mean equality. Equity means that each person is given what they need so that everybody's on an equal level. Accountability and transparency, and then fifthly is participation. The public must participate in developing their health care plan and deciding what their priorities are and what kind of system they would like to see. So then the legislation that was put forth actually talked about those principles in writing. I took it to Maryland. I showed it to our legislators. I was like, isn't this beautiful? It says, universal. Equitable. So that gave them a way to judge. And while they didn't get single payer in Vermont, they probably got one of the best health bills that we have in this country right now. And hopefully if they continue pushing, they can move it further in a direction towards creating a universal health system in their state. So it's fantastic. This is what needs to be done, is prioritizing where to put our energy, how are we actually strategically going to affect social change. Even though we had the majority, super majorities of Americans consistently want a single payer health plan. Even though a majority of physicians want a single-payer health plan, even though it's been done all around the world, it's not an experiment. Many other countries have some form of a single-payer health plan. We have all the evidence and all the data to show that this would work. We even have systems within the United States ourselves. We have the Medicare, which is a publicly funded, privately delivered type of single-payer system. And we have the Veterans Health Administration, which is a true socialized medicine. And both of them work better than our private insurance portion of our healthcare system. Even though we had all of this, we weren't able to overcome the corporate control of our political process and the corporate control of our media that misleads people and puts all these scare words out there whenever we get close to building momentum for real change. So we have to see that the single-payer movement faces the same obstacles that pretty much every other group that advocates for peace or social or economic or environmental justice faces. And that is that it's not about evidence in Congress. It's not about what the majority of people want in Congress. And so by coming together, by building a broader movement, bringing together the peace groups, the social, economic, and environmental justice groups together, and if we act strategically and nonviolently and with intention, we can actually overcome that corporate control of our political process. So that's why I joined with some other activists and Kevin early on as well, and we decided to organize something different. We saw that the traditional tools of democracy don't work. at the congressional level in this country. I mean, at the local level, you do have some more control, but at least at the federal level. And we needed to do something different. We were in Madison when they were occupying the Capitol in Wisconsin. We were very excited by that. And then also by what we were seeing around the world with uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and Spain. So in April, we started reaching out to other groups and saying, hey, what do you think about planning an occupation of Washington, D.C.? And people said, oh, we were thinking the same thing. So it was really neat that there was kind of already this kind of sense in the atmosphere among activists that we needed to do something different. And so groups signed on, people signed on, and we spent that 6 months, in addition to organizing the occupation of Freedom Plaza in D.C., but also thinking about what are we about? What do we mean? What do we want? And also, how do we get there? And it kind of boiled down to the simple phrases that we want to end corporate rule. We want to shift power to the people. And we think that we need to be meeting human needs and not corporate greed. That was another one of our catchphrases. And we looked at, we identified 15 areas of crisis in this country. And we outlined some of the solutions, evidence-based solutions that would address each of these crises. Because the solutions are there, the models are there. They're just not being heard. And Kevin wrote a great article called We Stand with the Majority of Americans, where he reviewed polling data on a wide range of issues, from workers' rights to preserving Social Security and expanding Medicare to all, to getting money out of politics, ending corporate welfare, closing bases, bringing the troops home, creating a green economy. All of these, we already have supermajority of Americans who support these positions. And Congress is going in the opposite direction on every single one of them. So how do we shift the power? I'm going to let Kevin talk a little bit about that. But we saw the Occupy movement as a way to bring the issues together, the groups together, and to be, it was a tactic. For us, it was an initial tactic to say, hey, we're not going to take it anymore. What's happening in this country is not acceptable, and we're standing out here camping in the middle of D.C. to say that this is wrong. In November, late October, early November, when the super committee was meeting, are you guys aware of the super committee that was looking at our deficit? And which I think is a revenue problem, not a deficit problem. We did a lot of actions, and actually, you should be really proud. Where's Bart? There he is. Leah Bolger, there's her husband. Leah couldn't be here today, the current president of Veterans for Peace. While we were protesting in the hall outside of the super committee hearing, Leah went into the hearing and walked up to the well where the whole super committee was sitting, and to their face, she told them, you are a fraud. You do not represent the 99%. And she was, if you ever get a chance to see it, it was on C-SPAN as they were hauling her out of the hearing room. She was very passionate, very articulate. And she was interviewed afterwards while she was in handcuffs. The police officer that was holding her, he looked so embarrassed because she was speaking truth to power, and he knew that. And so that was amazing. And we had our own super committee hearing on Freedom Plaza. We decided that the super committee in Congress was the occupied super committee. They're occupied by corporate interests. But on Freedom Plaza, we could have the liberated super committee, and we invited in experts, and we said, don't be constrained by what's being talked about in the media or in Congress. We want solutions. If you could do anything to address these problems, what would you do? And they came out with fantastic solutions. We could actually collect the $1.2 trillion that Congress wants to collect in 10 years. We can do it in 2 years just through a series of progressive taxes on the wealthy. And then in addition to that, we talked about creating a real jobs program and also forgiving student loan debt, which would be an economic stimulus to this country, ending foreclosure, you know, all these things that are staring us in the face. It was. So the super committee was talking about like cutting social insurances, Medicare and Social Security, and they didn't do it. They didn't have the guts to do it. They were supposed to issue a report on November 23rd, and they didn't come out and say that they would cut those services. So that's a win. And then most recently with the foreclosure arrangement with the banks that was just decided upon, the president was really pushing to go in the direction of giving the banks immunity from being prosecuted for their fraudulent behavior around foreclosures and evictions. And because of this whole Occupy Homes and the Occupy movement, they didn't go there. I mean, what they came out with was not sufficient by a long shot. but at least they did not grant immunity to these banks, and they even gave some money to states to help families fight the banks over their foreclosure. So that's another one. That's in a very short time. So this is kind of just a beginning of feeling the power that we have, but we haven't really tapped the whole power yet. So right now, we're in a phase of organizing and educating. We need to see this as a long-term effort, and we need to think long-term. We have to get ourselves out of the mode of election cycle thinking and really think long-term about how are we going to shift the power. So creating the single-payer campaign, this Healthcare is a Human Rights campaign, gives you an opportunity to build a broad coalition because it affects everybody in the state of Oregon and educate people about the issues that are going on, and hopefully even have some successes at the state level where you can have some influence to get a better health plan in this state. So I'm going to invite Kevin up to talk a little bit more about it. Yeah, me too. Okay, is that one on?
Let's see if this will work. This work? Oh, hey, that's so much better than great. So what was learned in the debate on healthcare when we had the chance to have a real interesting discussion about what works? So we had a socialized system, as Margaret said, with the VA. We had a single-payer system with Medicare, and we had a market system with the insurance industry domination. We could have had a real debate comparing all three, which one worked best. But instead, they took two of them off the table. The two that worked, and left us with the one that was the most expensive, least efficient, and provide the least coverage, the market-based system. And we saw this, debate charade, really, and ended up with what we expected, which was entrenchment of the insurance industry. And how did we get there? Well, we got there because there's a very organized effort in order to make sure that corporate power wins. When we did the Caucus 8 protest, 6 others joined us and risked arrest, and we did it. We got to that hearing. There were 22 witnesses, health insurance industry, pharmaceuticals, Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable. And when you looked at who was up there and looked at OpenSecrets.org to see how much money they had given to the committee, $3 million. What we had on our side, of course, was two-thirds of the American people support single payer. And that's been true for 10 years. We had on our side evidence around the world. We had on our side evidence within our own country, Medicare, that showed evidence-based solution, single payer healthcare works. Of course, the people and the facts were ignored, and the money won. Money, government. That's what we have. And I work on a whole range of issues in addition to healthcare. I work on the banking issues and peace and justice and how to deal with the new energy economy and create jobs. All these issues we work with on it'sourEconomy.us. That's the website. That's an economic project that Margaret and I run. And we see with every one of these issues the same thing. The money wins, people and facts lose, problems don't get solved. It's a dysfunctional and corrupt government. And so what we got into this idea of occupying public space by watching what was going on around the world, in Egypt and in our own country, in Madison. Margaret and I went out to Madison to talk to people who organized the Occupy of their capital, and got some ideas from that, how that worked and what the problems they faced were, and it helped us to think this through. And we, along with a handful of other people, started to work on this back in April. We went public in June, and by the time we went public, we already had more than 100 organizations signed on, more than 1,000 people signed on. Some very significant people like Cornel West and Chris Hedges had joined us, and we were on the road to the first occupation, we thought, of Washington in the United States. But then in July, Adbusters announced Occupy Wall Street, and we immediately, within a week, I think 5 days, we expressed support for that, saw synergy in that. And our organizers who were from New York started to go to their meetings, the General Assemblies of the planet, and we, promoted both. And we had, by that time, developed organizers in 30 states, and when it got to October, and late September and October, when the Occupy was taking off, a lot of our organizers stayed home and organized Occupies around the country. And so by the time we got out there on October 6th, lo and behold, there was the beginning of a movement. And that was, when we first started planning it, we thought maybe 50 of us would be out there by ourselves looking like fools. But instead, thousands of people were involved, and the media was paying attention, and we were getting an impact. And the impact we were getting was being part of the political dialogue. We were giving a voice to people who had no voice, people who had been voiceless in the past, the homeless, the underserved, the unemployed, the students in debt, people who had no voice but were affected by the destruction of our economy, the corruption of our economy by the 1% that controls it. And that was a new voice for people to hear. And we also forced those who do have a voice, the Chris Matthews of the world, to respond to our issues. And so the wealth divide, for the first time since the Depression, became a big issue. Polls changed over a matter of 2 or 3 months. Polls changed from people's concerns. The wealth divide became known. People became aware that the 1% has the wealth of 95% of us. The two facts I like to always point out that really show the extent of the wealth divide is 400 Americans have wealth equal to 154 million Americans. 400 have equal to 154 million. The IRS puts out a report every couple of years about the 400 wealthiest Americans, so it's a pretty interesting thing to look at. The other one that came out of about a month ago from an economist in University of California was that the 6 heirs to Sam Walton of Walmart have wealth equal to 30% of American families. 6 heirs. And they've done it by destroying our economy as well. And they provide workers with wages so low they need food stamps. And Medicaid. And all the social services then drain us further because they pay people so poorly. So that's the reality. And what's interesting about those facts, you look at the 400 people, also the IRS tells us that their average tax of these 400 wealthiest is 17.4%, compared to the working people tax 30%. So it's not because they are smarter and work harder, it's because they have rigged the game. They've rigged the economy, they've rigged the political system, they've rigged the media to keep us misinformed. That's what we're facing. Now the good news is that because of this wealth divide, we know how to fix the problems, because we know where the money is. We know who has the money. And there's ways to get the money to keep overseas as well. There's a lot of money hidden overseas. We can get that. Mitt Romney's money overseas, we can get that too. There's a thing called a global tax that will allow that. But so we know where the money is. And that's why when we did the deficit committee, and I really urge you to go check this report out. It's called the 99% Deficit Reduction Plan. You can find the report. We go through the history of changes in tax laws. Back in the 50s to the mid-60s, the top tax rate was 91%. Actually, it was 92 in like 1953 or 4, but 91% throughout that time period was a top tax rate. And what that resulted in was people didn't pay a 91% tax. What it resulted in was people who were going to be taxed at 91% decide to not take that income and invest it back in their business, invest it in the economy, create jobs. That period, the 1950s to the early 60s, was the period where we had the smallest wealth divide in the whole 20th century. That was the period. It was because we had a real progressive tax rate, which we've destroyed. But so we know where the money is. We know how to solve the problems. What's missing is our own political power to do so. And I think when we take on that political power, we need to recognize that the other side, the 1%, have acted with intention for 40 years to take control of the economy and the government. And it's probably even longer than 40 years, but I like to start in 1971 when Lewis Powell, who became a Supreme Court justice, in August 71, he was a lawyer in Richmond for the tobacco companies and a lawyer for the local Chamber of Commerce. He wrote a memo to the executive director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that laid out a plan for how corporations can take control. And he did this because at the time we had the Weather Underground bombing banks, literally bombing banks. They weren't just sitting in, they were bombing banks. We had the Black Panthers, we had the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. There was a lot going on that was changing the status quo, and the powers that be were afraid. They were feared losing control. And so Powell put forward this idea, and it wasn't just to take control of government. He put forward an idea to take control of the culture. And that meant the media, that meant universities, that meant journals, everything that affected and shaped opinion, then leading to the courts and the legislatures and the executive, both federal and state. And it was a plan. He said, look, this is not going to cost us that much money. For the amount of money we have, it's going to be a very small percentage. Shortly after that, there was a meeting in Washington, ABC, CBS, General Electric, all the media outlets, of course, that is, in those days. Then you had AT&T. all got together to decide how we're going to implement the Powell memo. And they developed a plan. And the Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, doubled in size in a year. We went from about 75 corporate lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to today we have 18,000. 18,000 corporate lobbyists in Washington, D.C. And that was done with intention. And over that time period, the progressive tax rate changed, the capital gains rate changed, corporate welfare increased dramatically, up to hundreds of billions of dollars a year in corporate welfare, even before the bailouts. It all went in that direction, and we've seen the media get more concentrated, the control of the message that we get about what's really going on, not being heard, but instead getting the corporate message. It's all changed. And so when we approach this, we have to recognize that this is a deep hole we're in. One occupation is not going to change it. It's going to take an ongoing effort, and it's going to take people focused and unified and persistent in a campaign that will be nonpartisan, independent of the two parties, critical of both. When we talk about independent of the two parties, we looked at other movements, and one thing that really stuck out for us on independence was what Dr. Martin Luther King said. He said he refused to be a part of either party. He thought that he didn't want to be the master or the servant of either party. He wanted to be the critic that held them accountable. That's our job. The two parties are part of the system, and it's the system that's corrupt. So the people are what count, and that's where we are. Now, you just can't be out there with, flowing flamethrowers at buildings and breaking bank windows. That's not going to be effective. We want to be effective. And so when we prepared for going out in October, we actually studied this. We looked at what worked to move political power to the people in nonviolent movements. There's a great website, Albert Einstein Institute, aeinstein.org. They've been studying nonviolent political change over the last 40 years, and they have developed a really good understanding of it. And what really resonated with us was their discussion about how the current power structure is held in place by 9 columns. 9 columns that hold the current power structure in place. These are things like the military, the police, civil servants, youth, workers, media, religious groups, nonprofit organizations.
And business.
What's that?
And business.
And businesses. Business, of course. How could I forget business? We always do this. One of us takes the 9 and we always forget one, and one of us remembers it. But anyway, so those are the 9. And the idea is you don't attack those directly. In fact, by the way, first of all, before I get into these, how you approach it, look at those 9 structures. They're already pretty weak. The military is ineffective and way overpriced and still stretched thin. The youth are this generation, highest debts ever, worst job prospects ever. Workers, union rights, collective bargaining rights, under attack. We had the peak income was 1973. We haven't had a raise since 1973 for most workers. The highest level for minimum wage was back in the late 1960s. So workers are in bad shape. Businesses are in bad shape. Look at the collapse of the economy. Look at the divide between big business and small business. And the small business is needing money, big business is sitting on it. There's divides there. So there's already fractures in these pillars. So our job is to build those fractures. And the way you build those fractures is not to attack them, but to pull people from those columns to our side. We want to grow our movement and weaken their pillars. And that means we have to act with intention. We have to, when we develop a tactic to achieve that strategy of weakening the current power structure, we have to act with intention with those tactics. And we have to be very careful about that. So with police, we want to make sure we're nonviolent. They have the weapons. They're good at violence. If we take the violence approach, we're not going to attract a lot of Americans to a guerrilla war against the U.S. military and U.S. police. We're not going to build our movement that way. And we'll be playing on their turf. Our turf, they don't know how to handle and have been very unsuccessful handling is nonviolence. In fact, we wouldn't have an Occupy movement if it had not been for nonviolence. The key images that really made the movement spark was a few women behind orange mesh plastic, already under arrest, not doing anything violent or threatening, and a white-shirted commander, one of the officers, came over and pepper sprayed them in the face. You could even hear at that moment one of the blue-collar policemen saying, "Wow, can you believe he just pepper sprayed her?" So you can see right there how our nonviolence divides their pillar, the blue collar and the white collar were in different places. Wow, can you believe it just pepper spray her while the white collar is doing it, already causing a divide there. And so it pulls those people to our side. And then that night you could see it on the news, the way it was reported. You know, the images of nonviolent protests being pepper sprayed. It really created an opportunity for us. And then you start to see a spark of a movement. Now, on the other hand, those women had been cursing the police, calling them pigs, war on pigs, F the pigs, throwing stuff at them. The opposite would have happened. The pepper spray would have been justified. The blue-collar cop would have said, thank goodness he just pepper sprayed them, calm those kids down. The people watching it on TV would have said, the police had every justification to do that. The media would have reported it that way. And so nonviolence is key for us, especially when dealing with police and the military. Now, it's not just protest that weakens the pillars. It's also creating an alternative. When we did our October 6th event, we had a two-pronged approach. It was called Stop the Machine, which was the protest part, Create a New World, which was developing an alternative economy, a democratized economy. Gives people a hope that there's an alternative. So it's not, people aren't afraid of the change. They can see that, oh, maybe there'll be a way to have food in the supermarkets when these guys are successful. Maybe the supermarkets actually have food in them. Maybe we'll get more organic food. Maybe things that get actually better. Maybe I'll be able to build some wealth. Because if you have a discussion about co-ops, people start to find out, wow, there's 125 million Americans who already are involved in a co-op. A lot of them in credit unions, a lot of them in food co-ops, worker-owned co-ops, and there's a lot of Americans who own businesses either through a worker-owned business or through an ESOP, which is a tax structure that allows them to share the profits. So you already see a lot of this is in place, and that's one of the advantages we have, is we're building on things that are already successful. That's an advantage we have. On the media, to weaken that corporate structure. Now, the corporate media already is weakening itself. Its credibility is at the lowest it's been. Depending on how you ask the question on a Pew poll, it's 20 to 29% of people believe what they hear in the corporate media. And their readership is down, their viewership is down, their profits are down. But while they're all going down, what's growing up is the independent media. Again, this has been around now for decades. Amy Goodman is on hundreds of stations. After a lot of hard work, she's built that up. There are other independent media outlets out there. The web is filled with them. The whole web media has become, built the independent media. You can now turn the TV off and get news from other places. And what's more recent, and maybe the most important part of the media struggle, is democratized media, where every person can be a media outlet. So that's the basic grand strategy, is to attack these pillars and recognize as a long-term effort of both a protest this power structure and build an alternative to the power structure. Let me just close with one final point. This is all happening at a time when so many of the approaches we take to dealing with issues is breaking down, is not working. Healthcare is a prime example. 50,000 people dying a year because they don't have access to healthcare. That's a policy, and 50,000 people, and our government can't face up to it. That's a policy that's dying and failure. The insurance companies are stressed about being able to survive. Despite we give them all these gifts, they still can't survive. We have to force people to buy their product. Can you imagine that? Forcing people to buy a corporate product. First time ever in our history. Corporate welfare on steroids. Requiring people to buy a flawed product that results in, when you have insurance and you have a health crisis, you end up in bankruptcy anyway, and you want us to buy that? They have to force us to buy it. That's basically it. Or they have to make the employer give it to us. Or they have to subsidize it in order for people to accept it, because it's crap. It doesn't work. And you can look at all the other issues. Energy. We're going through big problems in energy. We're getting so desperate, we're now talking about tar sands, which will, do so much environmental damage. Fracking, which does so much to put our whole water supply at risk because we are desperate for the old fuels. Nuclear power, Obama's still pushing that, despite what's happened in Japan, happened in Russia, happened in Pennsylvania. He's still pushing that. Offshore oil drilling, despite the Gulf of Mexico, he's still pushing that because they're desperate because the old energy sources don't work anymore, but they're staring in our face new energy sources. The whole green economy is going to that's the future. And we